There was a time when Aveling Barford was not just a name on the side of a machine. It was a weight pressed into the road. It was the slow, heavy movement of a roller, turning broken stone into surface. It was a dumper carrying earth across a construction site. It was a grader cutting shape into raw ground. It was steel, oil, heat, noise, and skill, all gathered inside a factory in Grantham, where machines were built to do hard, practical work. On the badge was a rearing horse, inherited from an older age of British engineering. It looked backwards to the world of steam, traction engines, and iron wheels. But the machines that carried it helped build the 20th century. Roads, airfields, quarries, housing estates, public works, and construction sites. Aveling Barford belonged to a Britain that believed engineering could solve physical problems. Mud could become road. Uneven land could become a building site. Distance could be shortened. Labor could be mechanized. Weight could be controlled, and then, slowly, the ground shifted beneath the company itself. The factory that had helped build modern Britain was pulled through mergers, financial crises, changing ownership, new technology, global competition, and the long retreat of British heavy engineering. The machines kept working long after the confidence that produced them began to weaken. So how did a company whose products helped shape the landscape become part of the story of industrial disappearance? And what was lost when the noise inside the works began to fade? To understand Aveling Barford, you have to begin before the company existed. You have to begin with the road. Today, a road is easy to take for granted. It is just there, a surface beneath tires, a line across a map, something people use without thinking. But before modern road machinery, roads were not simple. They were problems that had to be fought into existence. In winter, they became mud. In summer, dust. In heavy use, they broke apart. Horses struggled through them. Carts sank into them. Armies, farmers, merchants, and towns all depended on them. But making a reliable road required labor, material, and patience. Before machines took over much of the work, road making was punishingly physical. Stone was broken by hand. Loads were dragged by horses. Surfaces were compacted slowly, unevenly, and often by repetition rather than precision. The machine that changed this world was not elegant in the usual sense. It did not fly. It did not race. It did not sparkle in a showroom. It rolled. The road roller was one of those machines whose importance is hidden by its simplicity. Its purpose was direct: bring controlled weight to the ground until loose material became a firm surface. But that simple task demanded serious engineering. A roller had to be heavy, but not impossible to steer. Strong but not uncontrollable. Durable enough to survive vibration. Uneven ground, rain, dust, heat, rough handling, and long days of work. It was not built for glamour. It was built for punishment. One of the companies behind the later Aveling Barford name was Aveling Porter, a firm rooted in the 19th century world of steam engineering, traction engines, agricultural machinery, and road rollers. Thomas Aveling belonged to a generation of engineers who looked at the old dependence on horses and manual labor and saw a challenge. If a steam engine could power work, why should it have to be dragged by animals? If roads were essential to a modern country, why should their construction remain so slow and primitive? That was the practical genius of the age. It was not always poetic, but it was transformative. Engineers took problems that had existed for centuries, moving heavy loads, compacting ground, powering machinery, working fields, and attacked them with boilers, gears, shafts, wheels. And Iron Aveling Porter became part of that world of regional British engineering firms, whose names were tied to real places, real works, and real communities. These companies were not just logos. They were drawing offices, foundries, machine shops, apprenticeships, ledgers, railway sidings, and skilled men who knew the feel of metal under a tool. But the First World War changed the industrial landscape. During the war, factories were filled with urgent government work. Capacity mattered, skilled labor mattered, machine tools mattered. Then peace returned, and with it came a harsher world. Lost markets, financial strain, worn-out equipment, new competition and changing technology. Steam, once the heart of so much heavy machinery, no longer looked like the unquestioned future. Oil and diesel power were rising. Machines were becoming faster, more flexible, and more specialized. Customers wanted modern equipment, and modern equipment required investment. For older firms, reputation was not enough. In 1919, several British agricultural and engineering companies were brought together under a large combine called Agricultural and General Engineers. On paper, this looked like the answer. A bigger group could coordinate sales, reduce duplication, strengthen exports, and compete with larger rivals. But consolidation does not automatically create strength. Sometimes it creates distance. The companies inside the group had different histories, different products, different markets, and different problems. Some were still tied to older technologies. Some needed capital. Some needed modernization. Their central office could impose structure, but it could not easily recreate the local knowledge and practical flexibility that had allowed the older firms to survive. The combine struggled. The idea was ambitious, but the reality was heavy with debt, overlap, and complexity. By the early 1930s, agricultural and general engineers had collapsed into receivership. For Aveling and Porter, this could have been the end. Barford and Perkins, another ancestor of Aveling Barford, had its own history. Based in Peterborough, it was known for rollers and agricultural machinery, but also for other practical equipment used in farms, dairies, kitchens, and industrial settings. It belonged to the same culture of useful engineering, the kind that did not always attract attention, but quietly made work possible. By the early 1930s, both names carried experience. Both carried reputation. Both carried knowledge built over decades, but both were vulnerable. That is where Aveling Barford begins, not as a fresh company full of easy optimism, but as a rescue from crisis. Aveling and Porter and Barford and Perkins were brought together, with support from Ruston and Hornsby, another major British engineering name. The new company, Aveling Barford, was formed in the mid-1930s and moved to Grantham. This move was not a simple change of address. A heavy engineering factory cannot be relocated like a shop. It has to be physically transferred piece by piece. Machine tools, stores, patterns, drawings, castings, benches, equipment, and unfinished work all have to be moved. More importantly, knowledge has to move too, the habits, judgments, and routines of people who know how things are actually made. The new home was Invicta Works in Grantham. The name Invicta suggested defiance. The horse badge carried the old Aveling identity into a new setting. And Grantham, already shaped by engineering and railway connections, became the stage for the company's next life. Imagine those first years, rail wagons arriving with equipment, men unloading heavy tools that had already served one industrial age and were now expected to help build another. The smell of oil, grease, and hot metal. The noise of plate being worked, engines being tested, components being moved across the shop floor. A company with two old names trying to prove that it still had a future. A factory like that was never just a building. It was a system of people and processes. A roller did not appear whole. It moved through drawings, stores, machining, fabrication, assembly, inspection, painting, testing, and dispatch. A dumper was not just a steel body on wheels. It was a combination of frame, engine, axles, steering, brakes, hydraulics, and practical judgment. Every machine carried the labor of people the customer would never see. Draftsmen, pattern makers, welders, fitters, machinists, clerks, storekeepers, apprentices, inspectors, test drivers, and foremen. For Grantham, Aveling Barford became more than an employer. A large factory changes the rhythm of a town. It shapes when people wake up, when buses run, when shops are busy, when wages arrive, and what families expect their children might become. In an engineering town, a young person did not simply get a job. They entered a world with its own language and pride. There were drawings to read, machines to understand, tolerances to respect, mistakes to avoid. There was banter, discipline, hierarchy, noise, danger, and skill. A works could be hard, strict, and exhausting, but it also gave people identity. It allowed a town to see its own name travel far beyond its streets. By the late 1930s, Aveling Barford had become strongly associated with road rollers and road-making machinery. This was a crucial moment. Britain was preparing for a motor age, and soon for war. Roads, airfields, industrial sites, and public works were no longer peripheral. They were central to national life. The roller remained important, but the company could not live on rollers alone. The world of construction was expanding. Modern sites needed more than compacted roads. They needed earth moved, ground leveled, trenches cut, loads carried, surfaces prepared, and materials handled quickly. The work was becoming broader, heavier, and more mechanized. Aveling Barford followed that shift. It developed dumpers, graders, small bulldozers, trenching machines, concrete mixers, and other construction equipment. This was not a decorative diversification. It was survival. The company was moving from the older world of road compaction into the larger world of earth moving. The customer had changed too. A contractor did not buy sentiment. Their quarry owner did not care about heritage if a machine failed under load. A road crew wanted equipment that started in bad weather, worked on rough ground, and came back dirty rather than broken. Reputation was earned not in advertisements, but in mud, stone, diesel, smoke, and hours of work. Then came the Second World War. Like many British engineering firms, Aveling Barford was pulled into the national emergency. In wartime, the distinction between civilian industry and military need becomes blurred. Skilled workers, machine tools, and production space are too valuable to remain untouched. The company's capacity was redirected toward war work, including military and precision engineering. The discipline that had once gone into rollers and construction machinery now served a larger machinery of national survival. War can make a factory feel indispensable. Orders are urgent. Output matters. Delays carry consequences beyond profit. Workers who may once have built machines for roads and quarries now find their labor connected to defense, logistics, and national endurance. But war can also hide difficult questions. A factory can be busy because the state needs everything it can produce. That does not mean its peacetime future is secure. The deeper test comes afterward, when the emergency ends and the company must compete again in an open market. After 1945, Britain needed machines. The country had to rebuild bomb-damaged places, repair roads, expand housing, develop infrastructure, work quarries, build airfields, and modernize construction. The physical work of reconstruction required equipment, and Aveling Barford had the kind of machinery that could answer that need. This was one of the company's strongest periods. Its products fitted the age. Rollers helped make roads. Dumpers moved material. Graders prepared surfaces. Trenching machines cut into land. Small earth-moving equipment became part of the everyday work of rebuilding and development. The machines were practical, direct, and necessary. The company expanded its range. It reached export markets. The rearing horse badge traveled beyond Grantham, appearing on equipment in places far from the workshops where it had been assembled. This was the hopeful version of the Aveling Barford story, an old engineering tradition adapting to a diesel-powered world. Steam had not disappeared overnight, but the future was now being written in hydraulics, welded steel, transmissions, and engines that could meet the demands of modern construction. Machines grew larger, payloads increased, work sites became more demanding. The new world wanted equipment that could move more material, more quickly, with fewer delays. In the early 1960s, Aveling Barford was producing larger dumpers and heavier construction machinery. These were not polite municipal machines for gentle work. They belonged to quarry roads, open sites, and rough ground. Their value was measured in tons moved, hours worked, and time not lost to breakdown. But the bigger the machines became, the bigger the business challenge became too. Heavy construction equipment was no longer just a matter of building a good product. The companies that dominated the field needed scale. They needed research and development. They needed dealer networks, spare parts systems, finance, service support, modern plants, and access to reliable engines and components. A machine could be strong, but the company behind it had to be stronger. Aveling Barford had skill. It had history. It had a recognizable name. It had experienced workers and respected products. But history does not automatically provide capital. This was the pressure that began to close in. The company was operating in a world where competition was becoming international, equipment was becoming more complex, and customers expected more than a machine. They expected a complete support system behind it. In 1967, Aveling Barford was acquired by Leyland Motor Corporation. Soon after, Leyland became part of the larger and increasingly troubled British Leyland structure. At first, this may have looked like protection. A specialist engineering company inside a large industrial group might gain access to resources, engines, corporate backing, and a broader strategy. But a large group can be a dangerous place for a specialist firm. Inside a conglomerate, decisions are made at a distance. Priorities shift. Investment has to compete with other divisions. Product plans become part of wider corporate politics. A factory that once responded directly to its own market can become one unit inside a much larger struggle. For the people at Grantham, ownership changes were not abstract. They arrived as rumors before they arrived as official announcements. They were discussed at the gates, in canteens, in local papers, and at home. A new owner could mean investment. It could also mean rationalization, cost-cutting, product changes, or redundancy. To a corporation, a factory is an asset. To a town, it is a structure of life. By the 1970s, British manufacturing was under intense pressure. Inflation, industrial conflict, underinvestment, foreign competition, changing markets, and the difficulties of large national industrial groups all formed part of the background. Aveling Barford's decline was not caused by one clean event. That is what makes the story important. Industrial decline rarely happens like a switch being turned off. It happens by accumulation. A product range becomes expensive to update. A competitor offers better support. A parent company changes strategy. A market turns down. A factory needs investment that does not arrive. Skilled workers continue doing skilled work, but the structure around them becomes weaker. This is one of the hardest truths in manufacturing history. Good machines do not always save companies. Aveling Barford still made useful products. Its machines still had customers. Its workforce still had experience. But the industry around it had changed. Survival now required constant reinvention, capital strength, global reach, and the ability to absorb downturns. Skill was necessary. It was no longer sufficient. In 1983, Aveling Barford was privatized out of British Leyland. That moment could be understood as a fresh chance. The company was no longer trapped inside the machinery of a troubled conglomerate, but it was also a sign that the old shelter had gone. From that point, the company had to face the market more directly. The same pressures remained: competition, investment needs, product development, and the difficulty of keeping a heavy engineering business alive in a changing world. For the workforce, decline did not feel like a neat historical process. It felt uncertain, uneven, and personal. Factories rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. Work continues. Shifts happen. Machines are still built. Orders are still discussed. Managers still try to find a way through. Families still hope the bad news will pass. That is what makes decline so painful. The sound of production can continue even while the future is disappearing. By the late 1980s, Aveling Barford had reached insolvency. It was bought from receivership by Wordsworth Holdings in 1988. The name did not vanish overnight. Parts of the business continued. The Barford name survived in later forms. Machines carrying the old identity remained in use. Repaired, sold, exported, collected, restored, and remembered. But the age of Aveling Barford as a major Grantham heavy engineering power was over. What followed was not simple disappearance. Industrial decline rarely leaves a clean, empty space. It leaves fragments. A brand survives in one form. A product line passes elsewhere. A parts business continues. A former worker keeps photographs in a drawer. A machine turns up at a preservation rally. A family remembers who worked in which department. A town remembers the sound of the shift. Change even after the gates no longer mean what they once did. Machines outlive the system that built them. That is why the story still matters. A road roller does not ask to be remembered. It simply does its job. A dumper in a quarry is not a monument. A grader on a site is not sentimental. These machines were designed to work, not to explain themselves, but inside each one is a hidden history. There is the drawing office that shaped it, the machinist who cut the part, the welder who joined the steel, the fitter who assembled the mechanism, the test driver who listened for trouble, the clerk who processed the order, the apprentice who learned by watching, the family that depended on the wage. When people talk about manufacturing decline, they often use large words: globalization, restructuring, competitiveness, consolidation, productivity. Those words matter, but they can make the story feel bloodless. Aveling Barford brings the story back to earth. It reminds us that industry is not only a matter of markets and balance sheets. It is also a badge on a radiator grill, a works siren, a railway siding, a lunch break, a machine leaving the factory yard. Our town, seeing its name carried into the world on steel wheels. The company's tragedy was not that it failed to matter. It mattered deeply. It helped build roads, construction sites, quarries, and public works. It gave Grantham skilled employment and industrial identity. It carried forward the legacy of older British engineering firms. It adapted from steam inheritance to diesel machinery. It survived rescue, war, expansion, acquisition, and privatization. The deeper tragedy is that mattering was not enough. A factory can be important and still be vulnerable. A product can be respected and still be overtaken. A workforce can be skilled and still be exposed to decisions made elsewhere. Fay Town can build part of its identity around a works and still be forced to watch that works shrink. Today, when an old Aveling Barford machine appears in preservation, it often looks calm. The paint is restored, the badge is visible. The steel, once covered in dust and oil, is cleaned for people to admire, but it was not made to be admired. It was made to work. That is what gives it power. It represents a kind of engineering honesty, weight, function, durability, and purpose. No glamour, no luxury, just a machine built to meet the ground and change it. Behind that machine is the ghost of the factory that made it. The cranes, the lathes, the welding arcs, the test yard, the dispatch bay, the railway movement, the voices at the end of a shift. And behind that factory is a question that still follows many industrial towns. What happens when the machines that built the modern world are no longer built where they once were? Aveling Barford's story does not end in one closed gate or one final balance sheet. It remains scattered across roads, quarries, archives, photographs, memories, and surviving machines. The factory changed. The company passed through other hands. The old industrial certainty disappeared, but the ground it helped shape remained, and somewhere beneath the roads it once helped compact, there is still the weight of that lost works in Grantham. And if stories like this, about the machines, factories, and forgotten industries that shaped the modern world, are the kind of stories you want to see more of, make sure to subscribe to the channel